I was really looking for jargon and I didn't find any. Only one, which I found funny, which is the rolling stock.
Oh yeah, that you have to say rolling stock. You can't say train.
I really had to look it up, you know, on ChatGPT. What is rolling stock?
Like trains are for kids, you know. Like, rolling stock is for adults.
Hello, welcome everyone to another episode of the FSR Policy Briefcase. And to start, we wanted to remind you that we expect you not only to listen on Spotify or to watch on YouTube or SoundCloud or Apple Podcast. No. We have some listeners, I think, right? One or two that do it all. So that's the new, isn't that true, James?
Yeah, like my mom and maybe one or two others. Yes.
Exactly. And now we will also discover a whole new audience thanks to Juan. Juan Montero is the professor and director of our transport area. And I also wanted to say a few words because our transport area recently has accomplished quite a few things. They were mentioned in the Draghi report on competitiveness. You personally, Juan?
Yeah.
Indeed. Also, in the run-up to the elections, they did a big event with DG Move. Hundreds of people came there to discuss the future of transport. And I read in the summary of that event that there are a few issues like defense, tourism, on top of the normal things you discuss in transport that are picking up. But here today, we're going to talk about something more specific. One of the latest policy briefs of the team is tendering railway public service obligation contracts. And I have to get some jargon out of the way. I was really looking for jargon in your policy brief, and actually I have to say it's very educational because even experts like us from energy can read it and understand it. I was only looking up one specific word, rolling stock. What's rolling stock, Juan?
well, it's self-evident, isn't it? It rolls. It's actually, you're right, absolutely, it's the jargon. You should never say trains. It's rolling stock. It's the material that rolls through the railways.
I'll try not to mention trains too often in this podcast, and I will try to say rolling stock, or you hit me, James, whenever needed. So what I learned is that these tenders, right, is because we think some of the train services are commercially viable. I said trains. Some are not, but where's the border? Can you maybe first explain that?
Yeah, this is, I would say, one of the big discussions that we have in railways. I think the point of departure, it has to be understood. Railways is probably, out of the network industries, the one that has been hardest to liberalize. I mean, energy, aviation, telecoms, it was started and completed decades ago. Now, that's not the case with railways. In railways, we are getting to the end of it. Why? Because most of the service need public subsidies. This is an industry that runs on public subsidies, and there are very good reasons for it. Now, the point that there are a lot of public subsidies, and there are lots of services that can only run with public subsidies, doesn't mean that some of the services are commercially viable. Now, drawing the line, what is commercially viable, and you can just introduce competition and let the market run as in energy, telecoms, and aviation. Where is the borderline? That's the big discussion that we are having at the moment. The principle is that's for member states to decide, and the Commission steps in when there is a manifest error.
Okay. So
that's the principle guiding the difference, but there are very clearly divergent practices across member states. So you have member states where 100% of the services are what we call under public service obligations, PSOs, and there are other countries, I would say Spain, France, where on the contrary you have larger commercial services.
Because you talk mostly about regional train services as something that likely in each country will remain a public service obligation, right? Yeah. There are others as well, or?
Yeah. Most PSO services in most member states are regional services and suburban. So those trains, not the subway lines within the cities, that's outside the framework, and that's mostly run as a monopoly, but trains running just outside the city, 10, 15 kilometers, so the rail service in Paris, for instance, those are fundamental services. I mean, you cannot substitute them. We could not get into large cities without trains, and they are provided at heavily subsidized prices. So that will be suburban trains, regional trains, and then who knows? I mean, some long distance trains might require subsidies. Traditionally, it was always considered it was just for passenger services, not for freight. But even in the framework of decarbonization, the debate on, well, maybe some freight services could also deserve this PSO regime.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
And did I understand correctly that most countries are still nevertheless giving these public service obligation contracts their incumbent railway operators, right? So
that's the big change, and that's why we organize an event, and that's why we wrote the policy brief. Back already some decades ago, some member states started to tender the PSO contracts. First of all, there was an obligation formally to sign a contract. And that's new because it was not the case in the past. In the past, you would just have a monopoly and they would run the services, both what we call now commercial and PSOs. Then the first step was, okay, let's formalize it. If you are going to receive a subsidy, a compensation, it's because you have an obligation, so you have to properly define the obligation, and then get it into a contract, and then you calculate the compensation for the obligation. So I would say pretty standard. We have that in all the network industries. So the first step was to formalize it in a contract. As an obligation, formalize the obligation, who is under the obligation. The point was, okay, everything is formalized, but do I have to tender or can I directly assign the contract to my incumbent? Now that's what changed in 2023.
okay.
And in 2016 we adopted that fourth package. That was the fourth package was adopted, and one of the big changes in the fourth package was this set of 2023 as the deadline for member states to tender the PSO contracts, which of course is a big change, introducing competition, if not in the market, for the market, but that's a big change. Of course, contracts, there were pre-existing contracts, and these contracts could be very long in time. So the fact that you say 2023 doesn't mean that a contract that was signed 2, 3, even 5, 6 years before would automatically terminate. That's why there is a very long transitory period. If one stretches the transitory period to the maximum, and a lot of member states are stretching it to the maximum, it will be 2023. So January 1st, 2033, in theory, all member states should be tendering. It doesn't mean that only in 33 will be tenders, because it's just as the contracts expire, you cannot renew them anymore. So we will see more and more countries tendering, and what we have already seen is countries like the Netherlands, where the period for a direct action expire. It's not 33, but they went for a direct award, and an infringement procedure was open against them. So it's happening. And then what we have is, we have the pioneers, which I'd say was Germany, largest market, so it was an important experience. We had Sweden, also a pioneer, long time, a lot of experience in the tendering. And right now, the place where things are happening is France. Already for more than a year, they have been tendering, and that's what, I mean, the experience, it's a large country with a lot of influence, I would say, in the rest of Southern Europe in terms of legal traditions and types of contracts. So it's a very influential, very interesting exercise, and that's what we analyzed mostly in the lessons from these 3 countries, particularly France, which is where things are happening now.
So what are the big trends that you see, I mean, and what are your expectations going forward for this?
Well, first of all, this is a big change because at the end of the day, most of rail services are PSO services. They are not commercial. So I don't know, here in Florence, we meet very often to discuss competition in high-speed service, commercial services. It's very exciting. Then you see all the results and how prices are going down. But we cannot forget that at the end of the day, most services in terms of passenger kilometers are PSO services. So if the deep impact in terms of industry will not come from liberalization of commercial services and high speed, these fancy services, it will come from competition for the market in PSO markets, services. That's where we will see a change in first of all, in who will be providing the services. It will not be only the incumbents. We will, and we can already see it, incumbents in one country, so the traditional company entering other markets. And with competition, you see a lot of transformations. And the main one, I would say, in terms of the structure of the market, is that there is a very obvious chance, based on the experience in other countries, to reduce the cost of the provision of these services. And since you are tendering them, what can be expected, not everywhere, it depends on the conditions, but there is a very clear opportunity for costs to be reduced. So with the same money, you can get more PSO services. So you will get more frequencies, you can have more new routes that are not served.
You mentioned a few numbers, no? What was it? 15%, sometimes 20?
15, 20, I'm a little bit hesitant because it depends. I mean, in some countries, there is this idea that companies are not getting a subsidy, a compensation that really cover the costs.
Okay.
If that's the case, I mean, there is no potential to get a reduction. But based on the experience, I think it's interesting. There are two rounds. I mean, when you go for the first round of tenders, experience shows that you can have a reduction of around 20-25%, even a little bit more. But experience also shows that there is a little bit of overshooting, and that this winner's curse. I mean, contracts are won by those that make the largest mistake, by the optimistics. So when you go to the second round, then the reductions tend to be smaller, more into this 15-20%, which is a lot, allow me to say, because these PSO services, I mean, we are talking in the largest countries, we are talking billions of euros per year. So it's a lot of money in terms of reduction. And
it's enough to be mentioned in the Draghi report, for instance.
It is. I mean, and also in terms of citizens' experience. I mean, this is where the change will be felt. This is the train that workers are taking every morning to go to commute to the city center, to commute to the industrial areas. And this is where you might expect, with lower costs, not only costs for the authorities that are paying for it, the citizen doesn't really see it short term, but could expect an improvement in quality, and then some better services, frequencies, the rolling stock, more modern, for instance, because you reduce costs. So the experience in general is, both also in commercial services, is that quality of the service improves when you introduce competition.
Just to ask a stupid question, if I could, or put something to you, like that's kind of somewhat the optimistic, reading of it, right? You have more competition, better services, lower prices potentially, et cetera, 15, 25%, et cetera. But is there also not a risk that with this, winner's curse, or low-balling essentially to a point where it's not potentially viable, and these are now commercial actors rather than a public service provider, it is nevertheless a critical service for the population, same as provision of water or electricity, other services. Is there a risk that still, if those companies disappear, we don't have so much data, right? This is maybe things that have been going on in first movers for 10 years or so, that if those private organizations disappear, that they leave behind, they withdraw themselves, and then you have to have this kind of service provider of last resort come in, and, then the burden goes back onto the state, right? Because, as you say, these people still need to get to work. I'm just thinking a bit traumatized. There's somebody from the UK. We've had these terrible situations with not just the trains, but also, not just the rolling stock, but also the water system, for example, which was, a lot of that infrastructure was tendered and, it went to private organizations that were able to undercut the public provider. But in the end, when they didn't invest sufficiently in the network, the burden is carried by the state ultimately when they disappear and the assets are stripped from them?
That's a very good question, and I think something that, it's important to clarify from the beginning. The UK model, that liberalization that started in the 90s, and that it has been reversed in the last months, is very different from what is this process of PSO tendering in Western Europe. Why? Because in the UK, the incumbent was disappeared, vanished, and was distributed among the rolling stock was sold to what we call ROSCOs, rolling stock operating companies, private companies. They bought the stock and they would lease it to these franchisees that got the contracts. And there was nothing left from the old incumbent, the monopoly. And then you would have monopoly in the exploitation of the infrastructure. So infrastructure, monopoly, private entity, then service providers, these private franchisees, and then the ROSCOs providing the rolling stock, the trains. Now that's not the model really in Western Europe. In Western Europe, Most of the contracts, the PSO contracts, have been, after tendering, have been awarded to the incumbents. The incumbents do not disappear. So you still have Deutsche Bahn is got most of the contracts in Germany after a number of rounds. It's been for years. And in France, most of the contracts have been awarded to SNCF, the incumbent. Yeah. So that's the first difference. The second one, and this is, pioneers take more risks. And the British contracts, and there is a lot of literature and reports analyzing they had some weak points. And one of them was franchises just dropping the franchises once after making a lot of money. As soon as they would become, they would just drop it. Let me someone in a French ministry drafting a concession contract will never ever make that mistake. I mean, we have a very long tradition of concession contracts, and even if they are not, these are not 100% actually concession contracts, but the experience of just dropping without the parent company taking liability, that will not happen in France.
Okay. But there you go, it's on record. Juan said it.
No,
so
it is on record. I mean, the parent companies will take the liabilities for the. But that's an important. Contracts are complex, and you really have to go through the contracts, and we can learn from the UK experience.
And that's what most of the brief is about, right? That was really interesting to read, that you already collected all the experience with the different contracts and the different trade-offs that have to be made in these contracts, and I just wanted to highlight two and then ask you which you think are the more interesting ones. But one that struck me was the size of the contracts. And you already said these concessions are often expressed in kilometers, right?
Passenger kilometers.
Passenger kilometers. So you've learned, basically, in these few pioneering countries, that if it's too big, it's often the incumbent winning, right? And if it's too small, you have to do too many tenders. So you find somewhere a middle ground in the size of the contract. And then also the length of the contract was very interesting. Because you said if the length is too short, you cannot buy the rolling stock yourself. So you would need someone else to allow you to lease or whatever the rolling stock, because otherwise you don't have a length in which you can amortize basically that whole asset, right? So also there is a trade-off that you have to take into account in the governance. But I don't know which of these elements surprised you. For me, they were all interesting, but maybe some of the ones you are more interested in and will work on in the future? Or?
I think three. One, which is always the most delicate and relevant, is human resources. So the people, the employees of these incumbents, they have to move when the incumbent loses the tender, then they have to be transferred to a private entity, which is not as solid, and that's always a very delicate, and you have to manage that. That's very national. I mean, the issue is the same everywhere, but the national circumstances are very different. The rights that they have are different across member states, but that's definitely one thing, and it's the people, so it's always important. So that's, but again, we didn't deal that much with it because it depends a lot on the specific countries. Then I would say the most important one, I wouldn't say it's a surprise, but it's rolling stock, it's the trains. I mean, what do you do with the trains? The trains are the big barrier to entry. So if you want to participate in a tender, the tracks are already there. You will have to pay for the use of the tracks, which is the main cost in this industry, but that's taken care, and that's very subsidized. Basically, you are just covering just direct costs, and that's enough, so it's just a small fraction of the overall cost. Then you have human resources, the people, that's the second cost. But then automatically then you have the rolling stock. Now, the rolling stock have a very long life. I mean, I don't know what's your experience in your countries, but you can be running in rolling stock that is 40 years old. And it's refurbished, and sometimes you don't even notice. It can be, but it's very old.
Why don't they just transfer those? Like, if they can even transfer people, why can't they transfer rolling stock?
Yeah, you see, maybe that's something to be explained. For me, it's obvious, but it's like, well, this is not like planes. You have planes that can land in any airport. You have cars that can drive basically around any road in the world, not even in Europe. That's not the case with trains. Trains evolve as national systems, so you have trains that can run in specific tracks in their country, and not all of them. Let me put you an example. In Spain, we have 3 different gauges for tracks. So we have, for high speed, we have what we call the international one. Then the regular trains, they run on Iberian gauge. So it's a little bit wider. So we cannot run German trains.
No, but if you lose a concession in a certain area, the trains for that area could be transferred, no? To the one winning the concession.
But very often only within your member state.
Yeah.
Which is, in smaller member states, that's too narrow.
Okay,
so you cannot take, if Deutsche Bahn loses a large contract in Germany, they cannot take the trains and run them in Barcelona.
They could sell them to the German that beat them, but they would probably, which is, I guess, your point,
right?
Yeah,
that's my point, because
but
that's what,
But I guess they would get, they're not necessarily aligned in terms of, it's your competitor you're selling to, so potentially problematic.
That's the point.
Which is why you end up with these independent organizations that own the stock.
So one of the ideas is, let's accelerate ROSCOs, the rolling stock operating companies, UK model. So we have entities, private entities running, or maybe even state-owned. Yeah. But you have one model, private entities owning the rolling stock and just leasing to whoever wins the tenders. That's one option. Then the other one, that's the Swedish model, is that transport authorities get the ownership of the rolling stock and then they just lease it to whoever wins. And being public entities, which at the end of the day are the ones that are putting the money to pay for the rolling stock from the beginning, they just control it and they run it. Or the ROSCO is managed by the incumbent itself. But then you need to very heavily regulate it, because otherwise they don't have the incentive to lease it. Yeah. And then the compromise in the legislation is, okay, do whatever, but do something. I mean, you can. I mean, the legislation is not very prescriptive in terms of one way or the other, but you have to do something so that rolling stock is available. But just one caveat: it's too easy to say, okay, just use the rolling stock. We reduce this barrier to entry. First of all, I have always this idea. Well, if you're a newcomer, you don't build the trucks. You just take the employees from the previous company, and then you get the rolling stock.
What are you doing?
What are you doing? I mean,
new brand,
new color. I mean, it's just having trains different colors. I mean, I'm sure it will have some kind of benefits, but it's not a very powerful. I mean,
and on top of it, you have another process to come up with a single ticketing system. So even that you don't do anymore.
But then there is something that is more serious. These trains live for 40 years if you do the proper maintenance. Okay. If you take care of the trains because they are your trains. If you start leasing them to companies that have just a very limited period of the duration of the contract, you have to be very careful. So the idea is, of course, in all the European countries, we have trains. They are running, so it's easy. Let's just transfer one company, the ROSCO, the newcomer. Yeah, but think that in 20 years, you will have to renew them. Will it be for the companies, for the... maybe it will not be 20, it will be 15 or 12 because maintenance. So let's not get overexcited with the run. It's very challenging. It's the main barrier to entry for very good reasons. So we have to find a balance there.
Yeah, it's true. Once you've taken out the ownership of the train and then potentially to solve the problem you just discussed, the maintenance of the train as well, you're almost back at a situation where the state does everything again, right? And you've lost the advantage of the tender potentially.
And the differentiation. I mean, it's...
Yeah. No, very interesting.
But then the solution is to make the contract long enough, and then you can include the rolling stock in the contract, I understood.
Yeah, but there is a structural limitation there, because the life, that works pretty nicely for buses, which are under exactly the same legislation, it's the same regulation. Buses have a shorter life, so you can. It's more flexible. They can run in other countries, so you can sell them. That's the difficulty with trains. It's 40 years. You don't want to have 40 years contract. No. I mean, because otherwise, I mean, you have very few windows of opportunity where you open the market for tenders. If you just open it every 40 years, no one will be there waiting for that small couple of months.
The real solution is to be able to run the same trains all over Europe, so you can just move them around.
That's the single European railway area. that's a
separate podcast.
A separate podcast.
A lot of investment and a lot of effort in DG Move, in the European Commission, and the member states also in terms of investment, is to make the infrastructure homogeneous, so you can have a single area. And both commercial PSOs, the high speed we are more advanced. Not perfect as as the Spanish incumbent trying to get into France knows. But you can move. You have Italian trains in Spain, you have French trains in Spain, French trains in Italy, because we have a European, we call it signaling system. So trains can speak to the infrastructure across, and the gauge is that, and you only get European money to develop high speed if it is according to the European standard. But these suburban regional trains, this is older infrastructure. You don't have that much money to renew it. I mean, renewing, okay, let's make all the Spanish rail system international gauge. We are starting, but it takes decades. It's the gauge, it's the signaling, it's the electricity, it's the language that drivers speak. I mean, it's not like aviation, they all speak English, pilots are speaking English to the towers. Here, no, the controlling is done in the local language. Drivers coming from one country, they have to speak. Sometimes they have to stop and get a new driver to get into a new country because they don't speak the language. And so really there is a lot of work to be done. I was going to say, there is a lot of work being done. There is, but still a lot of work to be done to
so
get
we will have a transport area for a while at FSR.
For rail, no doubt. I mean, I always make the joke that we have people retiring now that started to work when they were young in railway reform, on liberalization, more than 30, 35 years ago. The whole career lapsed and we are still reforming the railway industry.
Very nice, very nice.
So to take you a bit back to the tendering, if I may, Juan, you already spoke a little bit about this, about, the EU doesn't prescribe do it like this or do it like that, but they just say, please do it. There are different models out there. Do you nevertheless see, I don't know, some kind of harmonization or some kind of gravity towards a given system? And you talk about the French case, that there's, tailoring that's even done at a regional level. So even in France, it's not necessarily the same approach. Is that really necessary, useful, or, is this just the result of politics interacting with policy?
Yeah, I mean, railways is very rigid. I mean, the infrastructure is very rigid because it's built to last decades. Rolling stock is built to last decades, so you cannot introduce shocks and expect the system to change fundamentally. So you have to do everything. You have to pre-plan everything and move very swiftly. So there are these very big divergences. So in some countries, it's for the national authorities to decide. Even in countries with a lot of devolution to the regions, for instance, in Spain, it's mostly the state who runs these PSO services. And today it would be them running the tenders. But then you have France, which is one of the most centralized countries. But this is one of the very few issues that was devolved to the region. So it's the regions organizing the tenders. But I wouldn't say the model is very different, because even if it's the ministry, at the end of the day, it's not that you will go for a national contract, just one contract. It's more about how you define it. And you made that comment at the beginning. What is the optimum size of each contract, each franchise in UK terms? But that's kind of the same if you're doing at a national level or at the regional level. And I mean, there are more fundamental. Yeah, it's not so much whether it's national, regional. It's more about what is the optimum, what is the size that I want to use, what is the duration of the contract. Very important, the risk attribution. Am I passing the commercial, the operational risk to these entities, be it state-owned or private, or will it be more like what we call lawyers a service contract, where me, authority, I take all the risk and I just draw to you how many frequencies, what kind of rolling stock I want. So I'm taking all the risk. Okay. These are the most, really the fundamental decisions. And the rolling stock, who owns the rolling stock? This is the kind of things that can drive differences on the results.
Okay, so if I understand well, we want to try and harmonize the physical infrastructure, get the gauges on the rails the same, for example, get the signaling the same, get the ticketing the same. But in terms of how you want to build the contracts, how you want to chop them up, how you want to, play with the details and intricacies, it's working to allow, member states, regions, so on and so forth, to find their own way.
Yeah, I would say that over time, probably we will learn what the good practices are, and we might want, but also in terms not only what works better, what is more efficient, but also the tricks that can be used to block competition and newcomers and companies from other member states. So I can perfectly see that at a certain point you might want to get back to the regulation and fine-tune it to block some bad practices and accelerate some good practices that bring efficiencies. But I don't think we are really there. I mean, what we need is more traction. Talking about trains, we need more traction and get more tenders and get more countries really tendering.
Last question I wanted to ask is on who organizes these tenders. In the brief, you were always talking about public transport authorities, and first I thought they were regulators, but they are not necessarily the same as a regulator.
No, you see, again, it's one of these funny words because the underlying situation in the member state is very different. So sometimes it will be the Minister of Transport, like in Madrid, for the whole country. In most cases, I would say it's regions, and very often it will be kind of a transport minister in a region. But then sometimes it's not really a minister in the big government, but you have specific entities running transport in charge. So they are public entities, but they don't belong to the formal ministries categories. So it varies, it's different. Sometimes you have entities that pull together representatives from the national, regional, the cities, and then they create this transport authority. But it's not the regulatory body. I mean, regulatory body plays another role, and then it's also an interesting debate what the role of the regulatory body should be. I don't think it's for a regulatory body really to tender. It's a different expertise and it's very intensive in resources. But I think that regulatory bodies have a very valuable experience, so I can see a role for them in analyzing the contracts, for instance, the tender documents, make sure that there are incentives for competition, and having in general an overview, making sure that the compensation in terms of PSO, particularly when you are not tendering, but even if you are tendering, if the compensation, if there is something wrong with the compensation, but I wouldn't say that it's really for them to tender.
Okay, thank you. I think we're all out of questions.
Yes, indeed. I mean, absolute pleasure, Juan. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to broadcast this work that we are doing on PSOs.
It's regrettably our obligation now to bring this rolling stock into station and call an end on it. But I have to just lastly say that our analytics show us that many of our viewers regularly watch the podcast but forget to subscribe to the channel. So please, shockingly, if you'd like to stay up to date, then please do make sure to subscribe. And of course, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and the many others we've described. We'd love to have Juan back, I think, to talk more about this subject. It's really been, I've enjoyed enormously getting into a bit of transport recently. What do you think?
Yeah, indeed. And I think I can sound much smarter if I use some of the jargon from now on,
It's getting quite fluid by the end, yes.
Don't say train.